You are living someone else's version of your life. Not entirely, not obviously, but somewhere between the person you were at 12 years old, the one who knew exactly what they wanted without anyone having to teach them, and the person reading the morning to-do list right now, a substitution happened. Quietly, gradually, so slowly you didn't notice it was occurring. And by the time you did notice, it had already become normal. And here's the part that stays with you. Somewhere, in some version of events that didn't happen, there's a life that was supposed to be yours. This video is about that life. And more importantly, it's about why you gave it up. To understand what happened, you have to start not with your choices, but with the person who made them. There's a woman named Bronnie Ware. She spent 8 years as a palliative care nurse in Australia, working with patients in their final 12 weeks of life. People at the very end. People for whom the future had closed and only the past remained. And she started recording something. Not their medical data, their regrets. The things they said when the sedation wore off and the performance of contentment was no longer possible. The things they said when there was nothing left to protect and no one left to impress. She published those conversations in 2012 in a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, which has since been translated into 29 languages and sold over 1 million copies. Think about that for a second. A book about deathbed regrets has sold 1 million copies in 29 languages. That's not a publishing success story. That's a measurement of how many people already suspected that something had gone wrong with their lives before anyone put words to it. The number one regret, the one that appeared in conversation after conversation, patient after patient, decade after decade, was this: I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. Not the life I was forced into. Not the life circumstance demanded. The life others expected. Passive, social, invisible pressure. The kind that never announces itself, never makes an ultimatum, never gives you a clear moment to refuse. Just the steady accumulation of other people's assumptions about who you were supposed to become. And most people, according to Ware, didn't notice they were accepting those assumptions. They just woke up at 73 and felt the distance between where they'd ended up and where they'd been trying to go. But here's what nobody talks about when they cite that statistic. And we'll come back to this later because it changes everything. The regret isn't just about courage. It's about something much older and much more specific. It's about a version of yourself you once knew so clearly that you didn't need to describe it. A self that existed before the world got to it. And the quiet, decades-long process by which that self was replaced by something more manageable. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent his career studying the structures of the human psyche, called this the unlived life. Not a vague concept, a precise one. He wrote that every human life contains a potential. If that potential is not fulfilled, that life was wasted. And the unlived life, he argued, doesn't simply disappear. It goes somewhere. It accumulates. It turns inward. And it begins affecting you from underneath. In the restlessness you feel on Sunday evenings, in the hollowness that follows achievements you thought you wanted, in the anger that surfaces in moments that shouldn't produce anger, in the person you become bitter watching succeed because some part of you recognizes in them the version of yourself you abandoned. Jung's most precise statement on this wasn't about individuals. It was about families. He wrote that nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. Sit with that for a moment. The life you didn't live doesn't just affect you. It reaches forward into the next generation. Your children, if you have them, if you will have them, will inherit not just your name and your habits and your Sunday routines. They'll inherit the shape of your suppression. They'll model the size of a life that a person is allowed to live. And they'll spend their own years navigating the gravitational pull of your unlived potential without ever being told that's what they're navigating. Now here's the question that everything else in this video builds toward. How does this happen? How does a child who knows exactly who they are become an adult who doesn't? What is the mechanism? Because if you understand the mechanism, you understand something about yourself that almost no one ever gets told directly. It starts with a word: expected. You didn't grow up being told, here is who you must be. The process is rarely that explicit. What you grew up receiving was something far more difficult to resist. A continuous, low-frequency signal about which version of you produced approval and which version produced discomfort. Which ambitions were celebrated, and which were quietly redirected. Which emotions were safe to express, and which ones made the room uncomfortable. Which dreams were treated as real possibilities, and which ones were gently, kindly, lovingly filed under things we don't pursue in this family. None of it was malicious. That's the part that makes it difficult to name. Your parents were transmitting to you the same signal that was transmitted to them, and their parents before them. A lineage of unlived lives, each generation inheriting a slightly narrower definition of what a person is allowed to become. Psychologists call this process socialization, the embedding of cultural and familial expectations into the developing self at a stage when the self has no capacity to evaluate or refuse them. You didn't choose the values you were given. You didn't choose the fears you inherited. You didn't choose the ceiling that other people's imaginations placed above your head. You simply absorbed them, the way children absorb everything, completely, uncritically, because the alternative was to be separate from the people you needed to survive. And here's where it gets specific. Research on self-concept development, particularly the work of psychologist Hazel Marcus at Stanford, whose Possible Selves framework was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1986, found that people carry 3 distinct sets of future selves simultaneously. The hoped-for self, who you want to become. The expected self, who you think you're supposed to become. And the feared self, who you're terrified of being. The life you actually end up living is largely determined by which of these 3 selves gets the most psychological energy. And in most people, according to the research, the expected self wins. Not because it's the most desired, because it's the least risky. The expected self comes with approval already built in. The hoped-for self requires you to risk that approval, and most people, most of the time, don't take that risk. Here's what that looks like in practice. Not in dramatic moments of confrontation or choice. In the small, daily, invisible decisions that feel like nothing at the time. You don't submit the application because you already know they'll say it's not practical. You don't say the true thing because you can feel the room tightening before you've finished the sentence. You don't take the path that felt right because no one in your family has ever taken that path, and the absence of a precedent feels like evidence against it. You redirect. You adjust. You tell yourself it's not the right time, and that there will be a right time, and the right time accumulates postponements until it becomes a life that passed. And none of these moments feel like surrender. They feel like maturity. They feel like responsibility. They feel like the reasonable person you've learned to be, making reasonable decisions in a reasonable world. That is the nature of the substitution. It doesn't announce itself. It translates itself into the language of wisdom. Now, the open loop we planted earlier. The number one regret of the dying, the wish for a life true to themselves, is not simply about courage. Here's what it's actually about. Bronnie Ware herself noticed something in the conversations she recorded. Most of her patients, when they expressed this regret, couldn't fully articulate what the life true to themselves would have looked like. They knew they'd abandoned it. They felt its absence as clearly as the absence of a limb, but the specific shape of it had become blurry with years of disuse. The version of themselves that had known, the child, the young adult, the person before the substitution, had been so thoroughly overlaid by the expected self that recovering the original felt impossible. Picture this. You're 22. You know what you love. You know it the way you know hunger or cold, not as a theory, but as a physical fact. It's not even ambition yet. It's just the thing that makes you forget to eat, the thing you'd do even if no one was watching, the thing that produces a quality of attention you don't get anywhere else. And you know it. You know it fully. Then life begins offering you substitutes. Not replacements, never replacements. The substitute is always slightly adjacent to the real thing, close enough to feel related, far enough that the distance between them is invisible until it isn't. You choose the version of the career that pays instead of the version that resonates. You choose the relationship that feels safe instead of the one that feels true. You choose the city that makes sense instead of the one that calls to you without being able to say why. And every substitute feels like a reasonable trade at the time, because it is reasonable. Reasonable is the currency of the expected life. And then one day, not all at once and not dramatically, you notice that you're living in a house you furnished with compromises. Every room makes sense. None of it feels like yours. Jung identified this moment as one of the most psychologically significant transitions in a human life. He called it the midlife confrontation. Not a crisis in the casual sense of the word, but a genuine reckoning with the gap between the life that was built and the life that was possible. He wrote, "I have seen the fate of those who have not lived their own lives, and it is simply horrible. Horrible. Not sad, not unfortunate. Horrible. Because the unlived life doesn't simply produce regret. It produces what Jung described as a slow psychological toxicity. The energy that should have gone into expressing who you actually are gets redirected into rigidity, into bitterness, into the peculiar anger of someone who has watched their own possibilities close and can no longer name what they're mourning." He was precise about what this looks like from the outside. The artist who never makes art becomes cynical about those who do. The lover who never risks loving mocks romance. The thinker who never commits to a philosophy sneers at belief itself. You don't have to reach for symptoms. You've met these people. You may, in certain moments, have been one of them. That particular tone of contempt for other people's choices that only appears in someone who recognizes in those choices something they gave up themselves. The unlived life doesn't vanish. It watches. Now, here's where Bronnie Ware's data and Jung's framework converge on something neither of them states directly, but that emerges from both simultaneously. The life you were supposed to live wasn't an accident waiting for the right circumstances. It wasn't a fantasy requiring perfect conditions. It was being built, continuously, instinctively, naturally, before the substitution began. It showed itself in what you chose when no one was guiding you, in the books you read twice without being assigned them, in the problems you solved just to see if you could, in the conversations that made you lose track of time, in the feelings that arrived in certain places or certain moments and that you couldn't fully explain but recognized immediately as more real than the ordinary. That data still exists. It didn't go anywhere. The substitution covered it, the way sediment covers something at the bottom of a river. The current running overhead looks clean, but the original shape is still there beneath it. Research on what psychologist Dan McAdams at Northwestern University calls the narrative self, published in Psychological Inquiry in 1993, found that people create a coherent autobiographical story to make sense of their lives. The narrative self is not passive. It actively selects which memories to foreground, which events to interpret as defining, which experiences count as who you really are. And crucially, the narrative self is revisable. Not infinitely and not without cost, but the story you're telling about your life is not fixed. It is a living document. Which means this: the distance between the life you're living and the life you were supposed to live is not measured in years or in missed opportunities. It's measured in the gap between the story you're currently telling and the story that was always trying to be told. And here's the thing about that gap that almost no one says plainly. It's not too late to close it. Not entirely. You can't unhappen the years. You can't recover exactly the version of yourself that existed before the substitution. But the capacity that was suppressed, the thing you were actually built for, the quality of attention and aliveness that appeared when you were doing the thing that felt most true, that capacity is not gone. It is waiting, in the way water waits under drought, not visible, but present, ready to move the moment the conditions change. Bronnie Ware wrote about what she observed in the patients who had, in some form, found their way back to themselves before the end. She described a quality of peace that was entirely different from resignation, a quality that only appeared in people who had, at some point, chosen the harder path, who had allowed the hoped-for self to win at least one significant argument against the expected self. These were not the people who had done everything right. They were the people who had done at least one thing true. One thing true. That's not a modest standard. In the context of an entire life shaped by expectation and accommodation, choosing one thing true, one unambiguous, undefended expression of who you actually are, can reorient an entire narrative, can shift the story from a life that was managed into a life that was lived. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The substitution felt like fate. The expected self felt like who you were. The life that developed from 10,000 small accommodations felt like the natural outcome of natural circumstances. But it wasn't fate. It was a pattern. And patterns, unlike fate, can be interrupted. You started this video because the title names something you already felt. That gap between the life you're in and the life that was supposed to be yours is not something you invented. It's not self-indulgence. It's not ingratitude. It's information. The oldest, most reliable information your psyche has, that the distance between where you are and where you were built to be is still something worth closing. You don't have to answer it today, but you do have to hear it. The person at 12 who knew without being taught, who felt the pull without being able to explain it, was not confused. They were clear, clearer than anything that came after. The work of the second half of a life, according to Jung, is to recover that clarity. Not to go back, not to pretend the intervening years didn't happen, but to take everything those years produced, the skill, the understanding, the hard-earned knowledge of what doesn't work, and put it finally in the service of what does. The life you were supposed to live is not behind you. It was never only behind you. It's the one that becomes possible the moment you stop calling its absence fate and start calling it what it is, a direction you haven't turned toward yet. We started with a substitution so quiet you didn't notice it happening. This is the moment you notice it.